here's something you don't see every day. The year is 1967, and the Beatles are looking for someone to write a screenplay for their next madcap film. The producers contact a young and up-and-coming playwright by the name of Joe Orton. Joe Orton is something of an iconoclast, a rebel. He's had some success in the West End, where they have their plays and such in London. So they contact him about writing their next kind of Richard Lester likely directed romp with the Fat Four. Now he doesn't even know who the Beatles are at this point, but he unearths an old play idea that he had. He rewrites it as a screenplay, submits it to the producers, and the producers return it without comment. He was not necessarily off the project, but they obviously were not happy with his first draft. So he punched it up a little bit, submitted it again, and lo and behold, they thought, okay, maybe this guy is our screenwriter, or at least he has the story that we want to film. I said that he was an iconoclast. He was not only a very sort of anti-social, anti-establishment person, he was gay in an era when it was not supposed to be, particularly in England, not supposed to be something that you were known for. But he had a boyfriend. His name was Kenneth Halliwell, and they used to write together. But at a certain point, Joe started to make a name for himself, and Kenneth failed to make a name for himself. So when a meeting with the Beatles was arranged and a limousine sent to their apartment to pick up Joe, not Kenneth, to go meet with the Beatles about further developing this story, well, they found them both dead in their apartment. Kenneth Halliwell, in a fit of jealousy, beat Joe Orton to death with a hammer and then took an overdose of sleeping pills. Obviously, there were no rewrites after that, and the Beatles never did develop the project. Fast forward to, say, the mid-late 80s. Joe Orton is having something of a revival on Broadway, in particular a play called What the Butler Saw. And there's an entity in New York called the New York Shakespeare Festival, which is also known as the Public Theater. And they were looking for a property to develop because a chorus line, their cash cow, was about to close on Broadway. So they found this obscure property that had never been developed, the script for the Beatles movie up against it. And they kind of took it under their wing. They optioned it very cheap. And they thought to call me to write the music for it because they knew how I had been kind of a Beatle-phile. I had studied the Beatles. I had done some fake Beatle albums on occasion. I was a musical advisor on the Beatlemania movie, so they figured this guy knows the Beatles. But when I took my first meetings with the producers of the play, I said, I don't want to write the Lost Beatles album. This is an opportunity for me to write something that I've always wanted to do, but is a product of my influences in this particular area, musical theater, in particular musical comedy. Those influences being, for instance, Gilbert and Sullivan, and Brecht and Weill, and Sondheim, and Bernstein, and such. And they say, okay, give it a shot. So I started demoing out the songs for this, and they said, well, this is pretty good music, we'll go with it, even though it isn't Beatles songs. We went to premieres, we had our rehearsals, we went to premieres, and there were a couple things wrong with the show. One was that everybody in the cast was required to have an English accent. And you can't imagine the horrible English accents that we heard from people who couldn't afford a dialogue coach. So that was probably a little disconcerting for the audience. We had other issues as well, but long story short, the show closed after 16 performances and was never performed again. It was never captured at the time. The pit band was 6 people. And it kind of languished until sometime in the 2000s, maybe about 8 or 10 years ago, we did a tiny little revival at a place called Joe's Theater where the original cast met. We sang the songs to my backing tracks. We had no band at all. And that was only the second production, I suppose. So here we are, fast forward to the present. I think Ko has already explained how he entrapped himself into doing this. But this is kind of what I always imagined would happen. A successful musical, if it's very successful, will eventually get this kind of treatment. It won't be your 6 or 12-piece pit band. You'll be doing a movie with a full score. So we've essentially skipped all those intermediate steps, you know. Pretend you're watching the movie now with the full score. Let me tell you a little bit about Up Against It. It was written in the 60s, of course, and the 60s was a time of great social turmoil. The women's liberation movement was relatively new. Gay rights had yet to be something granted to most people. And Joe Orton took advantage of these things by incorporating them into his screenplay. For instance, this world that he has created essentially is ruled by women, for the most part. There is still some conflict with men about who's actually in charge, and that is a subplot that goes throughout the entire production. But it's also about personalities, actual characters. And I have to warn you in advance, we had a little trouble dealing with that aspect of it, and this is how we dealt with it. We have hats. Here, you may have noticed hats all over the stage. And I'm not going to tell you what each hat stands for right now because you would never remember. But we're going to start out with a particular number and I will introduce you to those characters to start with. There are 3 principal members of the cast on stage in the study of Father Brody. This is Father Brody, and anytime you see this, you think the Pope, I don't care, you know, but essentially this is our religious symbol. Whenever there's the religious establishment, this is Father Brody, this is his hat. And for the first number, I'll be wearing it. Second of all, there is the mayor, who is a part of this confab. You got your mayor's hat? It's there. Okay. Mayor, when you see that, it's the mayor. The reason why I point this out is because the hats travel around. It's not always the same person singing that part. That's a certain byproduct of the way we produce this, but in order for you to keep track of who the characters are, look at the hat. Finally, there is Connie Boone. She is a principal character in this. She represents a certain aggressive, I don't want to say femininity, but because she is definitely not a feminine person. She is, in fact, at this particular point in the show, the chief of police. And she is a nasty piece of work. She's very sexually aggressive, sadistic. I didn't describe the mayor because he's a cipher. He isn't anything, you know. And neither is Father Brody, for that matter. But for the first number here, we are in Father Brody's study, and the 3 of them are in there discussing what they believe are the issues with young people today. Because they're about to expel 2 young men from their town, one of which has presumably deflowered Father Brody's daughter. You're going to meet all these people a little later, but put yourself now in the mood. 2016, Up Against It.